This video is inspired by this commenter who said, "Are you going to do a video on the recent study about Takakori samples?" Now, obviously, Takakori, being a location, is in Africa, which is why this question is being posed to me. Now, of course, I already had this on my list as I was talking about DNA and other locations in North Africa that were there. And I was going to talk about it in a couple of days, but there's no time like the present. So there's two main things that are important about Takakori. Firstly, it's in the Sahel, meaning it's in the Sahara regions of Africa, and it's in a cave, which is very important, something that is being ignored by a lot of people who are talking about it. What's more important is that these people in 2025 were able to get a full genome of these skeletons. And what they revealed was something that was really unexpected. Well, what could be possibly surprising about this DNA? Well, it arcs back to the previous people of Africa, and this is why we need to see the arc back DNA of Africa. So, as we can read here, although fossil remains show that anatomically modern humans dispersed out of Africa into the Near East 100,000 to 130,000 years ago, genetic evidence from extant populations has suggested that non Africans descend primarily from a single successful later migration within the human mitochondrial DNA tree, haplogroup L3, encompassed not only many sub Saharan Africans, but also all ancient non African lineages, and its age therefore provides an upper bound for the dispersal out of Africa. An analysis of 369 complete African L3 sequences places this maximum at 70,000 years ago, virtually ruling out a successful exit before 74,000 years ago, the date of the Toba volcanic super eruption in Sumatra. The similarity of the responsible for of the age of L3 to its two non-African daughter haplogroups. M and N suggest that the same process was likely responsible for both the L3 expansion in eastern Africa and the dispersal of a small group of modern humans out of Africa to settle the rest of the world. The timing of the expansion of L3 suggests a link to improved climatic conditions considerably earlier. The L3 mtDNA pool within Africa suggests a migration from eastern Africa to central Africa 60,000 to 35,000 years ago, and major migrations in the immediate post-glacial, again linked to climate. The largest population size increased seen in the L3 data is 3 to 4,000 years ago in Central Africa, corresponding to Bantu expansion, leading diverse L3 lineages to spread into Eastern and Southern Africa in the last 3 to 2,000 years ago. So, what does this mean? In reality, it means that every single person in the world is obviously related genetically to the diverse populations found within Central Africa, and that diversity is stronger within Central Africa than even the Khoisan people, and that one group that left Africa. That one group that left Africa has L3, but it can be boiled down to a small group which is N and M. Now, N and M were previously not found in Africa proper prior to a specific date, until obviously this one. And of course, N and M are thought to have originated outside of Africa. But with this finding, it paints a different story. Why? Well, that's because these people have their DNA N. But this is strange. Haplogroup N is supposed to only be represented outside of Africa. Did these people move back into Africa about 10,000 BC. Is this what happened? Well, there's a couple problems. One, these people seem to be isolated from all other Africans, which shouldn't happen since they're located within Africa. And problem number two is that these people have a different culture than what you would expect from an isolated tribe. They are pastoralists, meaning that they are already in their farming phase or their herding phase, where they have a bunch of cattle and a bunch of sheep. In order to understand this properly, we have to read the Max Planck Institute's report on it. A new study reveals a long, isolated North African human lineage in the central Sahara during the African humid period more than 7,000 years ago. An international team led by researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, has sequenced the first ancient genomes from the so called Green Sahara, a period when the largest desert in the world temporarily turned into a humid savanna like environment. By analyzing the DNA of the two 7,000-year-old naturally mummified individuals excavated in the Takakori rock shelter in southwestern Libya by the archaeological mission in the Sahara Sapienza University of Rome, the team showed that they belong to a long isolated and now extinct North African human lineage. This group of cattle pastoralists has only a minor genetic component of non African ancestry, suggesting that animal husbandry may have spread into the Green Sahara through cultural exchange rather than large scale migration. Moreover, the ancient genomes do not carry sub Saharan African ancestry, suggesting that, contrary to previous interpretations, the Green Sahara was not a corridor connecting northern and sub Saharan African. Okay, so there's a lot that we need to pull away from this. So I purposefully got that one from Wikipedia, and I did that on purpose. It's from Wikipedia, but they source it as the Max Planck Institute, which is true, but they source it in a sort of not honest way. Instead, we see that that isolated North African DNA is itself from sub-Saharan Africa. It is a sub-Saharan DNA. But the way that they phrase it, it makes it seem like it's not a sub-Saharan DNA, which it is, but it's different than any other DNA that's ever existed or that exists recently in the areas, but it's the same as the people that left Africa. Now, we all know that there was a group, and again, the longer ago it was, the less likely they were similar to the people who live today in the Middle East. So, there was a group of Middle Easterners long time ago that did move back into Africa, and we've discussed this a long time ago about who they would have been and how they would have mixed with other African populations in that region. But there's a migration back in carrying some Neanderthal DNA, which most sub Saharan Africans, as they call them, or black Africans, don't have this DNA. What complicates things even more is that, as you can see there, Neanderthal genetic traces, the ancient individuals had significantly less Neanderthal DNA compared to people outside of Africa, indicating a largely isolated North African population. So these people were also isolated beyond any other group. We're talking isolated from outsiders from Africa, isolated from Neanderthals, isolated from sub Saharan Africans or black Africans, however you want to say it. And this is one of the reasons why I continue to call them sub Saharan Africans because it's less confusing. I want to go to this statement over here, which says limited gene flow. The genomes do not carry sub Saharan African ancestry. Like I said, the ancestry that they do carry is sub Saharan African, but this is called to the point, so they're trying to make it as fast as possible. So they're not saying that this DNA is not sub-Saharan African. It is. It was the DNA of the people who were in East Africa who left Africa, but then suggesting that the contrary to previous interpretations, the Green Sahara was not a migration corridor between northern and sub-Saharan Africa. The spread of migration herding in the Green Sahara probably occurred through cultural exchange. Two positions. One, this is Libya, a very small location in Africa. So there's still a lot of space for people in Africa to move from north to south, even though there might be one isolated tribe. It also doesn't take into account the fact that there's many tribes in Africa that are genetically isolated from each other. But let's not look at that right now. If we continue to read, we will notice that this will be contradicted a little bit in the future by talking about the mixing of this type of DNA with other North Africans. So it starts off by saying the study provides critical new insights into the African humid period, a time between 14,500 and 5,000 years ago, when the Sahara Desert was a green savanna rich with water bodies that facilitated human habitation and spread of pastoralism. Later, aridification turned this region into the world's largest desert due to the extreme aridity of the region today. DNA preservation is poor, making this pioneering ancient DNA study all the more significant. Genomic analysis revealed that the ancestry of the Takakori rock shelter individuals primarily derived from a North African lineage that derived from sub Saharan African populations at about the same time as the modern human lineages that spread outside of Africa around 50,000 years ago. So, in other words, it's a archaic sub Saharan African ancestry, which, to simplify it, they say it doesn't have sub-Saharan African ancestry, but they're talking about modern sub-Saharan African ancestry. So I hope you guys are keeping up to the fact that this DNA that they found is mainly sub-Saharan African in its origin. The newly described lineage remained isolated, revealing deep genetic continuity in North Africa during the late Ice Age. While this lineage no longer exists in unadmixed form, this ancestry is still a central genetic component of the present day North African people, highlighting their unique heritage. So, a couple things here. One, proves that it's not an isolated DNA. Two, it also proves that the groups that lived in North Africa back in the day were not necessarily the same as these ones today have a much higher DNA of Neanderthal and they have a much higher DNA of Middle Eastern DNA. As you can see in these ones, much less DNA from Neanderthal, much less DNA from Neanderthal and the Middle East. So therefore, it must be shown or it must be understood that these people, at least in the recent history, have had a giant boost of Middle Eastern ancestry. And then it says, furthermore, these individuals share close genetic ties with 15,000-year-old foragers that lived during the Ice Age in Terfalat Cave, Morocco, associated with the Ibermerusian lithic industry that predates the African human period. Notably, both groups are equally distant from sub-Saharan African lineages, indicating that despite the green flow between sub-Sahara and North Africa, populations remained limited during the African humid period, contrary to previous suggestions. Now, without getting too deep into what they mean into this, we can know, and I'm not going to read this, but we can see that the Iberomaurusians had sub-Saharan African DNA. We've seen this before. I've read it 100 times. I'm done reading it. And especially those at the Tefrelite site, which is mentioned here. But of course, we do have some indicators of people coming from the Middle East into this region. Again, the people of the Middle East at this time would be very different. And of course, you can see with this new study that a lot of them were still genetically tied to sub-Saharan Africans. You can see there that their DNA, the people who were there at the time, are is a completely isolated DNA from the ones that would come later and differ greatly from the sub-Saharan Africans, whereas this one, as they mentioned in this new study, is derived from sub-Saharan African ancestry about 50,000 years ago. The study also sheds light on Neanderthal ancestry, showing that the Takakori individuals have tenfold less Neanderthal DNA than people outside Africa, but more than contemporary sub Saharan Africans. Our findings suggest that while early North African populations were largely isolated, they received traces of Neanderthal DNA due to gene flow from outside Africa, said senior author Johannes Krauss, director at the Max Planck Institute of Evolutionary Anthropology. So this is what I'm talking about when they say isolated but not isolated, received but didn't receive. And of course, let's first interpret those first two sentences. A lot of this is interpretation. You will notice. So the study sheds light on the Neanderthal ancestry, showing that the Takakori individuals have tenfold less Neanderthal DNA than people outside of Africa. This part is very important, but you'd have to go into the Neanderthal DNA to understand this. In order to have tenfold less, it means that these people are isolated from the people outside of Africa, meaning okay, so let's put it this way. If you're an African American, you probably have some Neanderthal DNA inside of you if you're from the era from, the people who came about 400, 300 years ago, 200 years ago into America. You probably have some of it. But because you have a majority black African DNA, it waters down the amount of Neanderthal DNA. And so this proves that they probably have, and yes, they do, have a majority sub Saharan African DNA. Now, when they say contemporary sub Saharan Africans, but more than contemporary sub Saharan African DNAs have zero Neanderthal DNA. This is what they mean. So, significantly from zero is anything. If you even get a trace of it, it's more than that. Sub Saharan Africans have 0%. So this shows that they have a little more, but at the same time, that the tribe that mixed with these Neanderthal DNA was getting it from a tribe that had already mixed with Neanderthal, if you understand what I'm saying. So there was a tribe, perhaps in the Middle East, perhaps in East Africa, that mixed with the Neanderthals, and then they mixed again, and that's why it's significantly less. Tenfold less is a lot. I mean, we already are looking at something. I mean, today it's about 2% in most people. Back in the day, it's only a few percentage more than that. And to have tenfold less than that, that's really stretching it. Of course, another finding that they talk about here, which they're going to talk about in detail when it comes to pastoralism, is the number of people coming from the Middle East doesn't seem to be in the millions. It doesn't seem to be in the hundreds of thousands. It doesn't seem to be that. It seems like it's a couple people who came from the Middle East. Again, we have to state this: the people living at that time, about 15,000 years ago, are very different. I mean, they're much closer to Africans than they would be later on, as we have seen in Europe and Asia when they reconstruct some of the DNA and some of the basics of what humans would look like back then. But this would also be watered down anyway by the fact that these people have a majority isolated sub-Saharan DNA, archaic sub-Saharan DNA, or ancient sub-Saharan African DNA. Now, of course, before I was just interpreting what they were saying, and I'm going to give my full opinion at the end about what we are seeing here, but let's first read it and deconstruct it for ourselves. Our research challenges previous assumptions about North Africa population history and highlights the existence of a deeply rooted and long isolated genetic lineage, said first author Nada Salem from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. This discovery reveals how pastoralism spread across the Green Sahara, likely through cultural exchange rather than large scale migration, which is what I just talked about. That the peoples who, even if they did get the pastoralism from the Middle East, which this is just an interpretation that they got it from the Middle East, even if they did, it wouldn't have been a people thing. It would have been more of a movement of the discoveries themselves, which I've suggested many times when I talk about ancient Egypt and how some early discoveries are clearly from the Middle East, but those that doesn't mean that the entire Middle Eastern populations wandered into Egypt. I think that's ridiculous. The study highlights the importance of ancient DNA for reconstructing human history in regions like Central Northern Africa, providing independent support to archaeological hypotheses, said senior author David Caramelli from the University of Florence. By shedding light on the Sahara's deep past, we aim to increase our knowledge of human migrations, adaptations, and cultural evolution in this key region, added senior author Silvino di Lernia from Spezia University of Rome. So that's their interpretation of the data. Let me tell you what my interpretation of the data is. Well, firstly, it shows that Africa has pockets, meaning it has regions within the area where certain people would live and not admix with other people that much. It doesn't prove that people didn't migrate to that region. It doesn't prove any of that stuff. It is true that they hardly found any DNA that was mixed with these specific people and the DNA of sub-Saharan Africans, but it's not true that these people did not mix with sub-Saharan Africans, as we can see in Teferot, where there was at least 3 DNA samples that were found: a ancient, not modern, and a prehistoric Middle Eastern DNA, a prehistoric African DNA, which is this one, and then this the sub-Saharan African DNA in Tefrelot, as I can show you with the Ibero-Marusians. If you care, go read it. It's very interesting. People still don't know how to interpret that DNA. Obviously, the way I interpret it is probably mainly on the African side. Something that's very interesting to me is that even though these people are very old and probably older than a lot of the dates where you start seeing farming in the Middle East or in Europe, instead of looking at it like these people discovered farming or these people were the ones who were close to the farming, or maybe even farming started in multiple regions including parts of North Africa, maybe even the Middle East, it's instantly interpreted as they got it from the Middle East. This is, again, in my interpretation, forcing the information to fit previous models. And you'll notice this the whole way that they go, okay, well, this can't be, that can't be. The fact that they have to continue to say sub-Saharan African ancestry, and they have to separate it by saying modern and ancient. And of course, how can you call a DNA that's in North Africa sub-Saharan DNA? This DNA here that they're talking about, it's not it's DNA that is of African. So it is African DNA and it's in Africa, stuck in Africa, and it represents probably the oldest version of African DNA, but it's in North Africa and they're calling it, sub-Saharan, which is not right. They have to just say what they have to say. Now, there's a reason why they can't call it black DNA, because of course it still makes it quite vague about what you're talking about, because of course there are black people in Asia. So I would go for native African DNA. I think that would be the true one, the most realist. And of course you can see this by the fact that the Neanderthal DNA is washed away. So if you're mixed African, you have some level of Neanderthal DNA, because the Neanderthal DNA is very old, the mixture. So as soon as Africans left Africa, they seem to have mated with the Neanderthals, and it's actually possible that some of them, maybe this tribe, they just turned around. So they didn't take too long to return. Perhaps one of the most important questions, which will probably be answered as the years go by, is what did these people look like? As also, we have the question of what do Ibero-Maurusians look like, which I think now people have settled that Ibero-Maurusians probably looked a lot like black Africans. And what would these people look like? Well, they probably look like black Africans, as most of their DNA reflects that. Now, there's something we read earlier that I want to bring back up, which is when they said prior to the out of Africa, so that small DNA that left Africa, there were a lot of other African peoples that left Africa, and I've talked about these before, but they died out. Now, there's actually more to this story than you think, because of course they focus on pastoralism instead of the entire culture of these people, but they use red ochre, which seems to be similar than as the ones that were used in sub-Saharan Africa, and it is possible again that they got a lot of their cultural traditions from sub-Saharan Africa, but because they're genetically isolated from modern sub-Saharan Africans, there is this interpretation that they are wholly different than the rest of Africa, which I do not think is fair. But, tell me what you think about the video. Tell me what you think about this people. This will only be one version of this video. I was planning to decipher this in a much deeper way, but because of the comment, I feel like I should tell you what I think so far, which, will be changing in the next few days because the information is just so recent.